Hello, my name is Eric Follick. I'm a Platonist contemplative ascetic and renunciant. Often in the secondary literature of dealing with spiritual traditions and practices and matters, there are incorrect statements based, made and then repeated, often, sometimes repeated many times, that are based on a either partial or incorrect or not careful uh, reading of the textual sources involved, or also not reading them from the perspective of a real contemplative ascetic practitioner. And these statements made and often repeated can in fact be misleading and spiritually harmful. One example of this from the Platonic tradition would be the statement based solely on the unreliable testimony of Augustine that Porphyry, in contradiction to Plato and Plotinus, didn't accept the fact of animal reincarnation. But in fact, that's not at all true. There's still extant Porphyry's own words in which he very clearly accepts the fact of animal reincarnation for unrighteous souls, and talks about it with great concern and emphasis on the importance of avoiding that. So that's just one example. Another example that also has caused a lot of problems and is also often repeated, sort of unthinkingly or based on what other secondary writers have said, is the statement that Plotinus allegedly attained a contemplative union, or union with the one or the good, divine union, or to use a term from the Western mystical tradition, the unio mystica, just four times, or only four times, based on a misreading of the a sentence in Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, and actually just even taking that out of context, even from the life, let alone with, as you'll see, a contrary statement in the Enneads by Plotinus himself, and how silly that would be from the perspective of an actual contemplative ascetic Platonist practitioner, and even also a student of comparative mysticism, and particularly one familiar with the Indian and East Asian traditions. So regarding that, I would like to read to you a slightly edited question and answer, a question that I received on this very matter, and my reply. And if you would like to see the original print version of this, or original slightly edited print version, you can see it at my other internet venues at platonistasceticism.blogspot.com and independent.academia.edu/Eric Follick. That's capital E, small r, I, C, no space, capital F, A, L, L, I, C, K. Okay, so here we go. I hope you'll be appreciative of this. So here's the question and answer. Okay. So here's the question. We had a conversation about the experiences that Plotinus had of ultimacy. There is a passage in Porphyry's biography that suggests that Plotinus had such complete experiences 4 times, or roughly 4 times, in Plotinus's life. I would add that actually there isn't a passage that suggests that. There's a passage that secondary writers have taken to suggest that. As I recall, you argued against that kind of reading and suggested a more steady and complete realization. I hope I remember your views correctly. Apropos this discussion, Ennead 4.8 begins with a rare autobiographical comment by Plotinus on just this topic. In parentheses, then Gerson translation, page 512. That's the newer Gerson et al. Translation. Often, after waking up to myself from the body, that is, externalizing myself in relation to all other things, while entering into myself, I behold a beauty of wondrous quality, and believe then that I am most to be identified with my better part, that I enjoy the best quality of life and have become united with the divine and situated within it, actualizing myself at that level and situating myself above all else in the intelligible world. Following on this repose within the divine and descending from intellect into acts of calculative reasoning, I ask myself in bewilderment, how on earth did I ever come down here, and how ever did my soul come to be enclosed in a body, being such as it has revealed itself to be even while in a body? Unquote. I looked up the McKenna translation, page 410, and I think it brings out some points with different emphases. And here's the quote as McKenna gives it. Many times it has happened, lifted out of the body into myself, becoming external to all other things and self-centered, beholding a marvelous beauty, then more than ever assured of community with the loftiest order, enacting the noblest life, acquiring identity with the divine, stationing within it by having attained that activity, poised above whatsoever within the intellectual is less than the supreme. Yet there comes the moment of descent from intellection to reasoning, and after that sojourn in the divine, I ask myself how it happens that I can now be descending, and how did the soul ever enter into my body, the soul which, even within the body, is the high thing it has shown itself to be. I think this passage gives evidence that, at the very least, Plotinus entered into supreme union, quote, many times, or, quote, often, and the implication is that Plotinus did this regularly, not haphazardly. I would infer that contemplation was likely a daily practice for Plotinus. The differences between McKenna and Gerson are intriguing, particularly in the opening passage. McKenna speaks of a process of, quote, lifting up, unquote, out of the body, unquote, and this seems consistent with the path of, quote, ascent to the divine. In contrast, Gerson's translation speaks of, quote, externalizing myself, unquote, and, quote, waking up to myself, unquote. Gerson's translation is, I think, a little more opaque, but I would be interested in your own understanding of this opening passage. Perhaps it is difficult to interpret, though the general gist seems clear. Okay, so that's the question I received from an informed questioner. And now here is my reply. Okay. Yes, I mentioned that the usual and oft-repeated interpretation of Porphyry's statement in the Life is absurd from a practitioner's standpoint and simply reflects the ignorance of the usual translators and scholars. I also cited that very opening passage of Ennead 4.8 as direct contrary evidence that the more common interpretation is incorrect. I did also say that I had no doubt that Plotinus entered into union with the One, into the good/one samadhi, so to speak, regularly and daily each time he sat down to his regular contemplation practice. First of all, Porphyry's statement simply says, in my own rough, quick, off-the-cuff rendering, quote, but he attained 4 times, I suppose, when I was with him, this goal in unspeakable actuality and not in potentiality, unquote. There is nothing at all in it to suggest that Plotinus only attained it 4 times in his life. I don't know where the silly interpreters got that idea from. Further, while it is possible to take the Greek as meaning, quote, with him, in the sense of the years in which Porphyry was with Plotinus in Rome. It certainly doesn't have to be, and can just mean while he was literally, quote, with him. That is, happened to be in the same room with him when he was or went into contemplation. So really all it tells us is that Porphyry observed his union 4 times, nothing more about Plotinus's number of times or frequency of union or his regular contemplation practice. Besides, how would the unaccomplished and relatively unperceptive Porphyry know if Plotinus was in union or not? It is hardly likely or even proper that Plotinus would tell him every time he entered into the divine union. As regards the Ennead 4.8 passage itself, I'm afraid that neither the Gerson et al. Nor the McKenna translations that you cite are very good or faithful. Armstrong's is a bit better. I would give again a quick rough off-the-cuff rendering as follows. Often, or many times, waking to myself from the body and becoming outside of the other things, but inside of myself, seeing a beauty marvelous how great, and trusting then especially myself to be of the better part, and affecting the best life, and having become the same thing with the divine, and being seated in it, coming to that actuality beyond all the other noetical, seating myself therein. After this state in the divine, coming down to discursive reasoning from nous, I am at a loss how I ever even came down now, and however for me the soul has become within the body, being this, of such a sort as has appeared in itself, even though being in a body. Unquote. I have rendered it as it is in the Greek, as one long sentence with lots of participles and clauses, and pretty literally, but hopefully it is clear enough. I don't think the differences in the translations reflect difficulty in interpreting and rendering the Greek, but rather just the lack of skill of the translators and the usual refusal to literally and faithfully render what the original actually says. By the way, that's such a common problem in translations in general. I'm not really sure why translators seem to often have an aversion to translating what the original text actually says, or think that they can only make it intelligible to readers by altering it significantly. Anyway, in any case, I think it is completely clear, especially in the original, that Plotinus is stating clearly that he frequently and regularly attained the contemplative union with the One, and that this was his regular contemplation practice. In fact, I would tend to read it as indicating that his attainment of the unio mystica, as it were, in contemplation was such a regular daily occurrence that he didn't even need to mention or specify it per se, but just say that often afterwards he would wonder what he was doing here, having fallen into individuated sensate existence in space-time in the first place. In other words, the, quote, often or many times, unquote, might refer to the wondering rather than to the contemplative union that was so regular and invariable an occurrence in his practice as to be taken for granted, that happened every day, every time he sat in contemplation, it just being that often he would later wonder or think about it, but not always, just practicing it and assuming it the other times. Further, a statement of Porphyry's in the life just before the, quote, 4 times sentence supports and, in fact, makes obvious my interpretation of the latter, contra the professors and as confirmed by the beginning of 4.8. I don't know why the statement is usually ignored in the interpretation of the, quote, 4 times sentence. Here is a quick, rough, off-the-cuff rendering of my own. And thus, most of all, to this godlike man, many times or often, bringing himself to the first and transcendent God in reflection, and according to the ways having been expounded in the Symposium by Plato, that God appeared who has neither shape nor aspect, but is seated above nous and all the noetical. Unquote. This seems to me, at least, to clearly say that Porphyry himself thought that Plotinus regularly realized the one or the good in contemplation, and that this was a regular practice of his, not just something he attained, quote, only 4 times, and supports my interpretation of the Greek of the, quote, 4 times statement, that Porphyry is only saying that he happened to be physically in the same room, for whatever reason, with Plotinus 4 times when this happened, not at all that it was restricted to just those 4 times, and was not a regular occurrence in practice for Plotinus. Presumably, Plotinus did his daily contemplation alone by himself, as is only to be expected and is only proper. But Porphyry happened to barge in on him in contemplation those 4 times. So, there you have it. I hope that is of help, or clear and is of help to some people out there. I know at least one other person has asked me in confusion about that statement in the secondary sources, and I do think, as I said, that it can be misleading and harmful to people. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that video, and the main point, as always, is to renounce the world and devote yourself assiduously to contemplation based on asceticism within asceticism yourself, and strive to attain that very same contemplative union with the one that Plotinus so often and wonderfully attained, and attain liberation from the cycle of reincarnation. There is nothing, absolutely nothing else worth doing. Okay, thank you for watching. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.